right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Denise Thomas, owner of the Effective Communication. Thank you so much for joining us to celebrate the 101st anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment in Wisconsin. We know that these are challenging times for people and want to acknowledge that while also offering this uplifting hour to re-energize and rebuild our community. Before we start the formal program, we want to hear a few words from our host, starting with Melanie Stuber, Chair of the Northwestern Mutual Women's Employee Resource Group.
Thank you, Denise, and welcome everyone. I am so delighted to have so many Northwestern Mutual employees and community members joining us. As Denise noted, these are serious issues facing our community and country, and all of us are impacted. We hope the next hour feels both celebratory and energizing for the work ahead. When we planned our original event for March, we knew the work ahead was going to be challenging. Since then, we've added the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic and the call to civic engagement for social justice to our plates. Today, we hope to energize you for the important work ahead. We have a wonderful and thoughtful hour planned, thanks to our partnership with the Women's Fund of Greater Milwaukee and a team of committed volunteers from both our own Women's ERG at NM and the Women's Fund. At Northwestern Mutual, our employee resource groups are leading efforts for our company to be more diverse and inclusive. We have 8 ERGs at Northwestern Mutual, and each is sponsored by an executive sponsor. I'm honored to introduce our executive sponsor, John Grogan, Senior Executive Vice President and Chief Product and Innovation Officer. John, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Melanie, and good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to welcome this very large and diverse group of Northwestern Mutual employees and community guests to both celebrate and learn from history. I have the honor of welcoming you to this event as the executive sponsor of Northwestern Mutual's Women's Employee Resource Group, as Melanie just mentioned. As many of you know, Northwestern Mutual is making a very deliberate investment in advancing women in our workforce, and our Women's Employee Resource Group is providing absolutely critical leadership to this work. Led by Melanie, whom you just met, this group is making history within our company and our community, and on this important anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment in Wisconsin, I'm really glad that you're here today to take some time to not only make history, but to celebrate it and to learn from it. As Melanie just suggested, to be fair, celebrating right now admittedly may not feel, well, it may feel difficult, as the past few weeks have certainly been challenging for all of us, and I want to acknowledge the significance both of what's going on in our community in this moment that we are in, and offer that in some respects, I think this makes a comprehensive understanding of history even more important. So today's theme of inclusiveness was selected months ago, but in the midst of a global pandemic and civic activism regarding social justice, that theme seems particularly poignant and timely today. History helps us understand not just ourselves, but our society and how change occurs. And this understanding makes us all better people and ultimately more effective leaders. So today, we celebrate and learn from history that many of us, frankly, don't know that much about. We're celebrating the effort of many to pass the 19th Amendment that expanded voting rights to women. We also have much to learn from this history. While incredibly important, the 19th Amendment secured the right to vote only for white women. Knowing this history hopefully provides insight for more inclusivity in our efforts to engage people in our democracy today. This is why today's event is so important, why I'm so happy to have employees representing all of our employee resource groups here, as well as guests from similar advocacy groups and from companies across Milwaukee. We all, after all, have things to celebrate and to learn from the history of the 19th Amendment. So my sincere thanks to each of you for being here today. And with that, I'm going to pass the microphone back to Denise Thomas, who's going to get our program started. Thank you again.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Melanie, for your great insight and remarks. I am absolutely excited and thrilled to be a part of today's program and most importantly, to be able to partner with one of the most highly regarded organizations in this community and in this state. So as John had mentioned, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution granted women the right to vote. It prohibited any United States citizen to be denied the right to vote based on sex. And it was ratified on August 18th, 1920, after a long struggle known as the women's suffrage movement. And the reason why I wanted to reiterate the amendment summary, I also wanted to talk about why it's important, and especially during the times that we are in today as it relates to quarantining, isolation, navigating through a global pandemic, and in the recent events regarding racism in this country. Voting ensures women's rights regarding reproductive and economic process. The 19th Amendment has helped and will continue to help millions of women, including myself as a Black woman, to move closer to equality in all aspects of American life. Women continue to advocate for job opportunities, fair wages, education, sex education, and birth control, and the ability to thrive and have an abundant life. And so when I look at each of you and your beautiful faces, I want to remind you that during this time of uncertainty, the 19th Amendment has already given us permission as women and as women of color to continue to be great. We as women do not have to ask for permission to be great. We do not have to ask for permission to vote. So when I say that, I want to underscore that oftentimes we're looking for affirmation. We're looking for someone to say, you're okay, you're good, you're qualified. When in actuality, our predecessors, the women who fought for us to have the right to vote, have already done the work. Now, what is the work for us to do in 2020 and beyond? And part of that work is exercising our right, not our privilege, not our formality, but our right to vote. And especially during these times, I wanted to emphasize the importance of why it's important to vote. Traditionally, women, and this is a fact, this is not a feeling, traditionally, we as women have voted based on the influence of the men in our lives, whether it be our fathers, our grandfathers, our uncles, our husbands, and in some cases, even our sons and nephews. We must do better. We can do better in terms of our voting habits and educating ourselves in terms of why and who we are voting for. It has been evident over the past 4 to 5 years in terms of the recent presidential elections and the upcoming election that our vote matters. Regardless of the position that you take in our party, whether it's Democrat, Republican, independent, moderate, we must educate ourselves better and understand that when we go into the polls as an individual, as one person, we are doing something that is going to magnify and amplify how every citizen in this country is able to exist. Let me elaborate a little bit further. When I was growing up in Evansville, Indiana, that's why y'all hear me say y'all, because I got a little bit of Southern in me in the state of Wisconsin. I turned 18 during the presidential election of where President Bill Clinton became the president of the United States. And I want to say he became the 42nd president. During that election, I was attending school at a small, historically Black college and university known as Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. And when I went to vote, I realized that I had not registered my absentee ballot, and I was told that I would not be able to vote. I immediately took the last $20 out of my bank account. Now remember, this is college, and this was 1992 or 3. So back then, yes, you could fill your gas tank up with $10. And I drove from Jackson, Tennessee to Evansville, Indiana to vote. It took me 4.5 hours to drive from Jackson, Tennessee to Evansville, Indiana. And it took me literally 5 minutes to vote. And I drove back to Jackson, Tennessee from Evansville, Indiana for another 4.5 hours. And each of those 9 hours and each of those $20 that I invested so that I could exercise my right to vote does not even come close to quantifying and accurately representing and thanking the number of women and the number of men that advocated and fought for me to have that right, both as a woman and as a Black woman. So each of us have our own dynamics that make us who we are. But we all have, as women, one thing in common, and our common denominator is to make sure that whatever decisions that we are making are towards the upliftment and the growth and prosperity of women in general, especially in this country. How we vote represents our power. How we educate ourselves on who we vote for represents our power. So no matter what type of woman that you are great, you are phenomenal, and you already have the permission and the tools that you need to be great and to vote. So as I close, I want to emphasize 2 words again: power and vote. You have both. Now is the time to educate each other in terms of voting at both the local and state level, whether it's voting for lawmakers in Milwaukee or in our state capital of Madison, in addition to the United States of America as a whole. Whatever changes that you need, you don't have to seek out. It's not a responsibility from others. It's yours. So remember, whatever you need to do in order to gain back that sense of power and hope and growth, start by exercising your right to vote. You can't be denied. You won't be denied. That is our power as women. Thank you so much. And I thank you for the virtual applause. I appreciate it. So what we're going to do now is go into transition into our introduction of some amazing and distinguished women that we have on our panel. If you are ready to have your life change for the better, keep continuing to eat. If you're eating, if you're having a lunchtime beverage, your life is about to be changed. So please give us your undivided attention. So as we introduce our distinguished panel, everyone, please know, on our panel represents an organization that is dedicated to social justice and advancing inclusiveness in democracy. You can see already by the names, faces, and organizations represented that we are in for some energizing and interesting insight. You may also notice on the screen that there is an email address for you to send questions for the panelists. So please, audience members, feel free to send questions throughout the presentation. We have a team gathering them for Q&A. So without further ado, let's kick this amazing panel discussion with Deborah Patel, who is the current president of the Women's Club of Wisconsin and a wealth of knowledge regarding the history of the 19th Amendment. Good afternoon, Deborah.
Hi, thank you, Denise. As John said, we can learn from history. And I thought I would summarize the suffrage movement using stories that may help shed light on today's America. I learned these stories through studies at the Women's Club of Wisconsin. That said, the views I share are mine and mine alone. The long, hard, glorious, miserable slog down the road to the 19th Amendment was a very important marker in American history. It was a huge victory for voting rights. But like all history, it was not perfect. Like all social movements, it included marches in the streets and meetings in back rooms. Men were in control. They had to give up control. And in a final act, a mother wrote a letter to her son, and that act made all the difference. So today's theme is inclusion. Well, the road to women's suffrage was actually all about exclusion. Women could not vote. Even the 15th Amendment, a failed post-Civil War attempt to enfranchise former slaves, excluded women. And the suffrage movement itself was not inclusive. Desperate from support from the South, there were white suffragists who were willing to exclude Black women from the 19th Amendment altogether. Others remarked that the laws of the Jim Crow South would keep them from voting anyway. Race has always been an issue in American history. It was an issue in the suffrage movement and in the Women's Club movement, which was part of the road to suffrage. The club movement, as it is often called, began in 1868 when women who were excluded from men-only clubs decided to form clubs of their own. These were not suffrage organizations, but they encouraged learning, created networks, taught women how to organize, and benefited their communities. Soon, a national organization, a federation of women's clubs, was the largest women's voluntary association in America. The Women's Club of Wisconsin was one of America's first women's clubs. It never joined the federation, but it hosted federation events in early June of 1900 when thousands of club women came to Milwaukee for a convention. At that convention, a fierce debate ensued between New England and Georgia. Georgia threatened to leave the Federation, walk, if colored clubs were admitted. The South had lost the war, but by then was busy winning the peace. Eventually, Georgia prevailed. Colored clubs need not apply. 13 years later, when women marched in Washington, a racial divide was clear for all to see. African American women suffrage organizations were placed at the rear of the line. Men had to agree to give women power. They finally agreed after a persistent inside-outside game. March 1913, thousands of women head to Washington, the first major protest march in our nation's capital. Things got violent and women were injured. Still, they persisted and finished, and completely overshadowed President Wilson's inauguration the next day. January 1917, women formed the very first picket line in front of the White House. "Mr. President, how long must we wait?" their signs read. There they stood every day, regardless the weather. Eventually crowds, sometimes hostile, sometimes violent, gathered. So the police took control. They arrested the peaceful protesters. They did not arrest the attackers. Still, the women persisted. The arrests turned into jailhouse hunger strikes. Hunger strikes turned into forced feedings, with jailers thrusting tubes down women's noses and into their stomachs. The press heard and wrote about it. The women were released. The photos were damning. The American public was outraged. Even President Wilson was appalled. That was an outside game. Meanwhile, others worked inside the system, using their influence, using their networks, reaching out to people in power, convincing, cajoling, threatening. Eventually, President Wilson took up the flag for women's suffrage, and Congress passed the amendment May 21, 1919. And on June 10, Wisconsin was the first to ratify, followed quickly by Illinois. But until the very end, the end was not certain. 36 states had to say yes. The battle was fierce and ended in Tennessee. In August of 1920, a woman wrote a letter to her son. She said she did not know where he stood on the issue, but he must vote for the women. He opened his letter and he read, and so it came to be that the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature walked into the State House, signaling that he would vote no, but he voted yes. Tennessee was the 36th state, and in November 1920, millions of American women voted for the very first time. Thanks for letting me speak.
Thank you so much, Debbie. That was awesome. Appreciate your knowledge and insight. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Chia Vang from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Her work makes her an authority on both the perspectives of Asian American voters as well as the work of engaging students in the democratic process. Dr. Vang.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here, everyone, wherever you are. I hope you're doing great. I want to say how much of a pleasure it is to be a part of this panel and talking about such an important topic in our society. In the next few minutes that I have, I hope to briefly touch on some of the perceptions about voting within our Asian American community, and then highlight some of the barriers that we experience and strategies that we actually have been implementing to overcome those barriers, and then share with you some comments about what we are doing or what I am doing or the university is doing to really help to engage students and to become civically engaged. So I like to kind of point out that the Asian American community is very diverse. If you didn't already know that, nearly all of the more than 20 million Asian Americans trace their roots to about 20 origin groups from East and Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent. However, 6 of the groups actually represent about 80% of the Asian Americans in this country, Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. The remaining groups represent each, including the Hmong people who are the largest Asian group in Wisconsin. We all then represent less than 2% of the Asian American population. I want to take you, it would be impossible to not do this as a historian, but I want to remind you, or you may recall, that when the 19th Amendment was passed, the United States, in fact, had in place a Asiatic barred zone, excluding Asian migration to this country. Those who were actually present in this country were deemed as aliens ineligible for citizenship. So it would not be until the passage of the 1952 Immigration Act, also known as the McCarran-Walter Act, that Asian Americans were granted the right to be citizens and to vote. So as you can see, it hasn't happened for everybody all at the same time. But I want to remind you also that the sizable Asian American population that we see today really emerged after the 1965 Immigration Act. So today we have a very high percentage of Asians who are foreign born. The majority of the 11 million eligible Asian American voters in 2020 are actually naturalized citizens rather than American born. So with so many people being foreign born, I think some of the biggest barriers we've experienced include this very fact that I think we can all agree that voting is multi-generational habit, right? If you see your parents voting, your grandparents voting, then you learn how to vote. But if you come from families where you have not had that experience, then you have to kind of build that habit yourself. Some of the Asian Americans also come from countries where there's no history of political participation, or where it was dangerous for them to voice their political opinions. So many, even though they're in this country, are afraid to express their political views. One of the other biggest barriers that our community have experienced is language barriers, right? So if you go to the polls and you don't speak English, if you don't have interpreters, it can be very difficult for people to feel confident to vote. And even though Asians as a group have some of the highest educational attainment and also socioeconomic status, we know that the Asian community is very diverse. We also have some communities that are, living in poverty, and so low turnout rate among all races in those communities are very much present. But for a lot of the newer Americans in those communities, voting may not be a priority if they're struggling with daily life. And then just one more barrier that we've experienced is the fact that political parties often don't reach out to Asian Americans because we're smaller communities, so people think we're insignificant. So if people don't reach out to us, and then we're not as likely to go to the polls. And one final barrier is that Asians are so diverse that we don't have one language, right, to unite everybody. So voter education has been difficult, but indeed that has not stopped the Asian American community from educating and mobilizing people to vote. Voter rights education campaign, the Asian Pacific Islander American Vote, or APIA Vote, has been very active in education. groups are coming together. There's a hotline for people to get information about voting in 9 different Asian languages, voter registration in our communities, people coming out to our community events to help us register to vote, including, the League of Women Voters. And I think the Asian American community organizations are now becoming much more involved in helping to eliminate language barrier by volunteering, having people be available at the polls. And I have seen in the last decade or so an increasing number of campaigns reaching out to community members in the Asian population, including myself. I get lots of calls from people running for election. So those are the kinds of things that we have, implemented to overcome barrier in voting. And as a faculty member, I cannot do this conversation without talking about the role that colleges and universities have in helping our students to become much more engaged in the political process. I know that we must do this work because so much of the work we do is about shaping the kinds of future citizens that we want to have. So at UWM, we have a nonpartisan student voting work group that has developed a all-in campus democracy challenge 2020 action plan. And the goal is really to turn out students to vote. The plan also really addresses the fact that students of color are voting at a lower rate. And so we are now involving our multicultural student centers to reach out to students that they have relationships with. And I have the pleasure of working with the multicultural centers. So I'm very passionate about empowering people to understand that for many of us, in fact, we didn't get to vote for a long time. And so if students understand the history, the struggles that so many people, as Denise said, fought for and died for just so that we can go to the poll, if students have that kind of understanding, it will motivate them to vote. So on a very, very personal note, I, as a faculty member, always tell my students to go vote. Of course, I tell them, I'm not telling you who to vote for, but I remind them when it's, election day, have they voted, and really helping them to understand that struggle that people went through just so that they and I can do the same thing. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bang, for that inspiring and educational remarks. I greatly appreciate that on behalf of the attendees. Our next panelist is the president of the League of Women Voters, Peggy Creer.
Thank you, Denise, and thanks to NML and the Women's Fund for putting together this event and for inviting me to speak. The League has been encouraging people to vote for 100 years now. The League was formed in 1920 as a nonpartisan grassroots organization, encouraging informed and active participation in government. The vote is a means to an end, to make our government better. And to that end, the League advocates for government policies that serve the public interest. Its first major legislative success was the 1921 passage of the Shepherd-Towner Maternity and Infancy Protection Act. So that right there reflects the influence of women's suffrage. Of course, the fight for voter rights continues even 50 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, because we still see voter suppression in different forms. The League also promotes other measures to improve elections for decades, going back to the 70s. We've advocated for redistricting reform to end gerrymandering and advocating for the elimination of the Electoral College and to instead vote for president by a national popular vote rather than through the Electoral College. So voting demographics, you ask, who votes? Well, generally, the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. In the November 2016 election, people aged 65 and older had a voter turnout rate of 71%. The turnout then decreases by voter age as you go down until you get to the youngest voters, age group 18 to 29, and they had a turnout rate of 46%, although I think it has grown since then. I don't want to pick on younger people. Some of the reasons for not voting have nothing to do with apathy. It is simply easier for some people to vote. They have the proper ID, they have transportation, they have time. It's easier for some people to vote than it is for others. But still, we're looking at that gap from the youngest voters turning out at slightly less than 50% to the older voters turning out at greater than 70%. We know that the baby boomer generation has a lot of political clout. They're a big generation and they have a high voter turnout rate. But the millennial generation is actually bigger. And so that represents a lot of potential political clout if they increase their voter turnout. And of course, the same can be said about any demographic group, because politicians listen to voters. And for those who say they don't think their vote matters, please note that Wisconsin is a swing state. And so unlike people in a lot of other states, we are bombarded with television ads before elections. And that's millions and millions of dollars being spent with one goal, hoping to change your one vote. Because on election day, that's the only thing that matters, those vote totals. Lately, there's been a lot of misinformation about the security of our elections, and particularly surrounding voting by mail. I want to say up front that multiple studies have shown that voter fraud is something that occurs extremely rarely. The Brennan Center for Justice is a really good source of information on that. So voter fraud is a very high risk, low reward crime. It's hard to make sweeping generalizations about elections in our country anyway, because elections are run by the states. And Wisconsin has a very well-run election system. I want to make 2 points about voter registration. The electronic poll books that are used by the elections clerk at polling stations, those are not connected to the internet, and they have a paper backup. But the most important thing to know about voter registration is that you can check and confirm your registration anytime by going to myvote.wi.gov. And that's a good thing to do a few weeks before elections, to make sure your registration is there, it's still active, and to re-register if you need to. Regarding vote counting, 90% of Wisconsin voters cast their vote on a paper ballot. And the other 10% use a touchscreen machine, but that has a paper backup, and it's voter verified paper backup. So that's the gold standard for election integrity. Voting equipment in Wisconsin is not connected to the internet, and municipal clerks are required by law to conduct a public test of the equipment before elections, and random audits are done after each election. Absentee ballots, whether you vote absentee ahead of time or by mail, those ballots are sealed by the voter in an envelope, and those are not open until election day when they're fed into the voting machines. The city of Milwaukee counts all of its absentee votings in one location called Central Count. And I've worked at Central Count for several years, and I can attest that the ballot procedures there are very strict. Ballot processors work in pairs, and members of the public can observe the process as well. And on election night, the results are typically hand-delivered or phoned in, and the official results are certified by county boards of canvassers, and those are made up of the county clerk and 2 members of the public from different political parties. So it's a good system. And last, I want to stress that because of the pandemic, most people will vote by absentee ballot in November and in August as well. There will be an unprecedented number of absentee ballots, and it's going to take a while before we know the results. But if you were old enough to remember, in 2000, that presidential election, we didn't know the results for 5 weeks because it was tied up in the courts. So it's okay. It's important to do it right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peggy. I feel like I have a new sense of information just from hearing your remarks. And we all know that knowledge is power, so thank you so much. Our final panelist is Shauntay Nelson from All Voting is Local. I'm so excited. Shauntay, how are you?
I am lovely. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for being a part of this. Again, I am from All Voting is Local. I am the Wisconsin State Director here based in Milwaukee, and we do statewide work around the local vote. All voting truly is local, and I know that we've just listened to the history of the suffrage. We've listened to Asian American and student engagement information. We've talked about turnout and advocacy and election security and election integrity. And so as I sat and I listened to what was being presented, I just kept thinking to myself about how local voting really is, the power of the local vote. There is no level of government that is more directly impacted, or that directly impacts our community, than our local elected officials and our local elected government. Voting local also impacts us more directly than any other vote. I know a lot of times we focus on federal vote, we focus on voting for in presidential elections, or we'll focus on other things. But I often tell people, especially leading into this year and all that we all experienced on April 7th, when we think about that, a lot of the changes that happened leading to April 7th were made by local electeds. There were some, of course, that were made and finalized by federal electeds, but most of those changes that led up to the absentee ballots and all of the different things happened through local elected officials. And so because of that, I try to make sure that people understand that every aspect of our lives are impacted by those whom we vote for in our local elections, be it policing and public safety. We have a lot going on across our nation. However, there is whatever decision that's made in the state of Wisconsin will be made by local elected officials. When it comes to public transportation, when it comes to affordable housing, no matter what it may be, all of these things are done and all of these decisions are made by local elected officials. So I often say, as well, one of the other things I try to tie local elections to is a lot of times we look at a lot of these federal policies. We can talk about women's suffrage, minimum wage, things such as these and the like. And when we look at these policies that are on a federal level, they all begin at the local and state level. Many of them they originated locally. And so that really is the power of the local vote. I want to go into what it really means to have voting access within our voting system. So when we think about voting access, and All Voting is Local, which is the organization that I oversee, is an organization that specifically works on eliminating barriers to the ballot box prior to an election. And so when we think about this, I am often reminded of, I share this quite often, there is a friend of mine who is actually a part of the League of Women Voters, and she often says the voting booth is the one place that we all have equality because we all receive one vote. But I want us to, and in addition to that, I want us to understand that it is important to create access when we're talking about participation within our democracy. Voting is truly foundational. It's fundamental to democracy, and we cannot have democracy without voting being a process of that. So when we talk about creating access, especially during a year like we've had 2020, we don't know if we'll be in the second phase of a pandemic. And so we have to begin to think about how are we going to expand access to early voting or ensure individuals have access to their registration. One of the things that was shared earlier is that you can check your registration online. In that same system, which is the myvote.wi.gov, you can also request your absentee ballot. You can also, once you've requested that ballot, go back out and check the status as to whether or not that ballot has been mailed to you. You can request both the August as well as the November ballot in one process on that same site. So it's kind of like a catch-all site, a one-stop shop, if you will, that particular site. But when we think about voting, one of the things that we have been working with our local electeds as well as our state elected election officials, which are those who actually run our elections, oversee our elections. We've been working with them to look at things where we have access to expanded voting, be it early in-person voting, be it absentee voting where you vote by mail, be it regular in-person voting. So a lot of times we call early voting, but it's actually in-person early voting. It's in-person absentee voting. And so we've been looking at drop boxes and ways that we can actually expand voting, as well as making sure, and I always encourage people to also think about those whom actually need to vote on election day. We want to be able to vote safely. in the midst of what is a real pandemic across our nation. So we need that access to be able to vote by mail. We also need in-person voting, and we cannot have an election without both, in my opinion. And I say that because we have individuals whom are in the state of Wisconsin, and being able to have access to ADA machines to cast their ballot is something that is real, and it is something that we should all be considerate of. We also have individuals with disabilities, and they cannot properly hold a pen or push a screen. And so being able to have that in-person voting is something that is important as well. So when we think about all voting being local, it really is the power of our vote that pushes us and that helps us to move democracy forward in a way where we are not stagnant as part of the democratic process, and that's the small d you all. But I wanted to encourage us. I love the way that Denise started this out, talking about power and voting. We really do carry what we need to be able to allow our voices to be heard. And it's not just about voting. We can't stop at the voting process. We also have to be willing to hold our elected officials accountable, begin to build relationships with those elected officials. And when those elected officials are maybe voting certain ways that we don't necessarily think is beneficial to our communities, be willing to stop in their office, set up a meeting with them, have a conversation with them, pick their brain, find out the why behind some of the movement that's being made. And once we find that why, we can potentially educate them. One final thing I want to share just in closing is this: it is imperative, it is absolutely important for us to engage with our elected officials once they are sat in that seat to represent our voice. And the reason I say that is this: I often say, especially within the state of Wisconsin, it's different in other states for sure, but Wisconsin specifically, elected officials run typically on issues. They run an issue-based campaign. And typically there are three issues that they run on, and whatever three issues they run on are the issues that they look into, that they research, that they try to familiarize themselves with. So as a population, once they are in office, we have to always understand that they've run on those three issues. And it doesn't mean that they don't know anything else. It just means that they are most familiar with those three issues. So it is our responsibility as constituents to begin to meet with them and educate them around issues that are important to us. That is called the electoral process, or the voting process. It doesn't end at elections. It literally begins at the election process. And then we educate our elected officials around things that are important so that they can literally uphold our voice when they sit in that seat to represent us. So thank you all for listening, and thank you all for the opportunity to share what's on my heart.
Wow, Shauntay, that was amazing. You literally have a virtual applause. All of the panelists were incredible. And I just want to hold this up for Shauntay to know that this is my absentee ballot application. And so I will be mailing this FedEx priority based on the inspiration that you've just provided me and the information. Again, ladies, thank you so much. What an amazing group of panelists. We could literally do this again, and Lisa and Chris, we may have to talk about a part two, because I just feel so educated and empowered. So our team is letting me know that we've received many great questions from all of our distinguished and amazing audience members. We thank you. They have been busy collecting and sorting for questions that were asked multiple times. So I am now going to turn this over to Dee Johnson of Northwestern Mutual, who has been fielding and sorting questions. Dee, please share our first question.
Thank you. The first question is for Peggy, and it's really a two-part question. Recognizing that we're in a very partisan environment, what tips do you have that will help people, number one, advocate and get out the vote, but doing it in a nonpartisan fashion?
Oh, thank you. Well, that's a good one, because that's what the League works on. The League is people who are very passionate about politics, but we take off our partisan hats to do the League's work. As far as getting election information, you could trust the League to provide that unbiased information. And I would direct people to a website called vote411.org. That has, it connects to myvote.wi.gov as well. there's everything you need there to see what's on your ballot, and even to learn the definition of different offices. What does a register of deeds do? That kind of thing. So it has those sort of definitions. I think to engage voters, the best thing to do is to talk about issues. What's important to you? Do you like the way that tax dollars are spent? Do they reflect your priorities? That sort of thing. I think that's a good way to get people interested. It's talking about issues rather than parties. And I think when you can remove party labels, you can have much more productive conversations.
Thank you. The second question is directed to Debbie. And the individual would like to know, what are some of the acts of civil disobedience that women engaged in to pass the 19th Amendment? Really relevant in today's environment.
Well, I would say that the two biggest ones I talked about were the march in Washington and the impact it had, and then it was the effect of the women being jailed for peaceful protest and the way they were treated was a tipping point in America. So that was important. At the same time, there were rallies held in every state. There was actually a dispute within the movement as to whether we should be trying to get votes at the state level or at the federal level. So while stuff was going on in Washington, there were also protests or rallies or whatever at the state level. All of that was part of the very public, outside game. Really, the ones I talked about are the ones that come to mind, but it was the combination and the sustained and persistent matter that made a difference, because at the end of the day, only society can decide to make change. And it really only effective change happens when the present becomes so uncomfortable that you have to change. And all of that passion and activity from then, we can see today in the discourse, that kind of thing we see today. Where that will lead us is really up to we, the people, to decide based on whatever we use an inside or outside game. I hope that sort of answers the question.
It sure does. Following up on the getting out the vote, this could either be to Shauntay or Peggy, but it's really looking at, I'm passionate about voting, but I don't really know how to go and get out the vote. I've never participated in it in this manner. What are some organizations or resources we can look to in order to help and volunteer to help people get registered and to actually get out to the polls when the election is here?
Peggy, do you want me to chime in? I can.
Please do. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So one quick way for sure, I'll say the League of Women Voters is a great organization to partner with. They do voter registration. A little different right now because of what we're going through as a community or as a nation, but typically voter registration on a consistent basis all throughout the year. In addition to that, I often tell people you can do simple things like, I call it relational organizing, where you can have your family members, your friends, those whom are close to you, those who live in the home with you, to do the very thing that we're asking you to do. Visit myvote.wi.gov. Make sure that all of your family members are registered, that they've requested their absentee ballot, have a voting plan. A lot of times, just making a voting plan will actually help a person to be able to carry out that voting process, because sometimes we think, oh, I'm going to go to vote on this day or at this time, and then life happens. And so when we set up a voting plan, it helps us to be able to carry out that voting process. And if you encourage loved ones to have a plan as well, that is GOTV, I think, at its core.
Thank you. And this is probably our final question, but in the, so I'm going to toss it up. I don't know who's the best individual to answer it, but what is your recommendation when a voter doesn't have or support any of the candidates running and they don't want to vote for the lesser of two evils? So they're undecided as they're walking in the voting booth.
I'll jump in there as well. This question has come up a lot over the last few weeks, and my encouragement has been to individuals in this manner. For all that we've gone through, especially those of us who are on this call and we're women, and we've gone through a lot. As it was stated at the onset of this particular time together, voting was something that we had to fight for. At one point, it wasn't even something that Black women could participate in, and then we were able to participate in that. And so I often tell people, one, don't forego your vote. I can never tell you, of course I could, but I wouldn't ever tell you who to vote for. What I would say is this: you would be better off voting for the lesser of two evils. And I know that's a little hard to hear. I know some will also encourage you to write in a name. My only challenge with writing in a name is this: when I do that, I position myself where that vote could have gone towards someone else. So in a moment like this, what I've been encouraging people to do is this: you have to be willing to list your values. What are the things that are important to you? What are the things that you stand for? When I vote my values. And then I have to be willing to look at both candidates and find the candidate that most closely aligns with my values. This is the reason why I say it cannot end at election day. Because if it ends at election day, then I just give up. But if I vote the candidate that aligns most closely with my values, and then I create a plan to engage, to hold that candidate accountable, to begin to find ways to connect with organizations if it's on a federal level and people are going to the Hill to maybe do some lobbying or some education, find ways to connect with those particular organizations and hold people accountable. It is about voter registration, voting, finding the issue that is important to us and holding that elected official accountable. And then once we hold them accountable, looking at how they vote concerning our issue, engaging additional public individuals or just additional community members, and then helping them to bring in additional people. That's organizing. And so I've often told individuals, it would be best, I don't want to tell you what you have to do, it would be best for you to find the candidate that most closely aligns with your values, start there, and then as part of the back end of that process, don't let up, hold that candidate accountable.
I'll just add a comment. I mean, Shauntay, I agree with, I'll just say I agree with everything, Shauntay, that you have said. As a community member who has been really engaged at, the local and, state and federal level, I often have community members, especially, among Americans who have come to me and say, it's really hard to know where these, what these candidates stand for. And they always ask me to tell them who to vote for, right? And it's really hard to, it's really hard to guide people, but I think you are right. I often remind people that, again, people die just so that you and I can check this box, right? And so why would you throw your vote away? So having somebody that mostly aligns with the issues that you care about is better than not voting at all. So I think if that's the message that we just continue to articulate to people, we will get people to come out. And I often remind them that, sometimes I don't even agree with myself, right? So, candidates, there's no perfect, right? But it is about what, people stand for and how they will advance the issues that you care about. Even if you don't understand or agree with everything they say, you have to understand what the, majority of, the issues that they really stand for. And that's more important than just, not going to the poll at all.
Excellent. Ladies, this is Lisa Atsnito. I'm leading the Women's Fund of Greater Milwaukee, and I'm batting cleanup here to say thank you all for participating. It was a fabulous, fantastic hour. I hope it helped you nourish your mind and body since it's lunchtime. The Women's Fund is really committed to advancing equity for women. We're thrilled with our partnership with the Women's ERG group at Northwestern Mutual. This is just one piece of all our work. In July, we'll be announcing our new HER Scholars. These are women who are age 35 years or older who are pursuing their first college degrees. And we are thrilled to have another round of scholars to announce in July. And we also do grants to area nonprofits doing systems change work. And I know there are some representatives from our grant partners on the call and participating today, which is great and fabulous and wonderful to have you with us. It is your power, not only of your vote, but the power of your philanthropy that really can make change in the coming weeks and months and decades to come. So we hope you enjoyed the hour. You will get a follow-up survey so you can share your feedback. Thanks again for IT support at Northwestern Mutual and all our panelists, Denise Thomas for emceeing. It was a fantastic experience. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.